They were standing there looking at the bank with funny expressions on their face, so I stood there to see what they were looking at. And about that time, I bang, bang, here come a couple of bullets whizzing by.
Hi, welcome back to That Doesn't Happen Every Day, a show in which we interview more or less everyday people about things that don't normally happen every day. We're going to start this episode with a photo. It was taken in 1939 in Powell, Wyoming, and on the left side of the photo is a 17-year-old kid. He's wearing a Letterman sweater, and then draped over his right arm is a gun. To his left, you can see the front door of the First National Bank in Powell, with the banking hours printed on the glass, but the U, R, and S of the text has been blown away, and you can see a bullet hole. The picture I'm talking about was taken soon after a lesser-known, very violent rampage that happened in pre-World War II Wyoming, involving poaching, a fugitive, the National Guard, and a man who was probably born way too long after Wyoming became settled. Jared Metz, author of The Last 11 Days of Earl Durand, takes us back to 1930s Wyoming and tells us more about Earl Durand.
He was something of an oddity and eccentric in the community. He loved to wander and roam and hunt, be in the outdoors. He spent probably 9 months of the year out in the wild, and the rest of the time he lived from then on in a tent alongside the family's house.
Even though Earl Durand was born in 1913 and grew up in a time of cars and trains, he was said to have ridden his horse all the way from Wyoming to Mexico. It was also said that he spent so much time living as a frontiersman that he had caches of meat and supplies hidden in the mountains around his tiny hometown in Wyoming. Tipton Cox recounts his own memories of the eccentric local.
He usually wore buckskins. Every time I've seen him, he had a buckskin jacket with a fringe on it. Some people have called him the first hippie, because he usually wore his hair kind of long.
One of the more ominous experiences Tipton had with Earl Durand happened on a shooting trip at the local dump when they found old dinner plates and began to use them for target practice.
He would bust the plate, and then he would break the pieces before they hit the ground. And he did that to about 10 or 12 plates. You know, I hardly remember a dozen words he said. He was pretty quiet.
In 1939, the 26-year-old Durand was arrested and charged with poaching, but he broke out of the tiny jail in Cody, Wyoming, and made his way to the seclusion of the surrounding mountains he knew so well. Like something out of a Western novel, the Park County Sheriff called on guides and cowboys from the local area to form a posse and bring Durand to justice. Jared Metz tells us what happened when Durand made it back into the mountains.
Earl had situated himself in a place where there was a vast talus slope, and below that a boulder slope. Nobody could get to him. He wasn't in plain sight, but they knew exactly where he was. And since there was no way to get to Earl, the sheriff decided that he would call in the National Guard with mortar and artillery, and also have an airplane armed with dynamite bombs and tear gas bombs.
The whole event just sounds surreal, but if you do look at Jared's book, you can see photos of a plane and what looked like munitions that were going to be used against Durand if they couldn't flush him out. The Montana National Guard has also confirmed their involvement in the pursuit of Earl Durand. Durand succeeded in killing 2 people who attempted to capture him after the sheriff rejected those 2 people for posse duty. After the shootings, Durand escaped off the mountain and made his way into Powell, Wyoming. Tipton Cox describes what happened when Earl tried to rob the First National Bank there.
If I think about it, it seemed like it happened just 5 minutes ago. It's that clear in my mind. It was on a Friday, first and only time I ever skipped school in my life that I can recall. 4 or 5 guys standing in front of Otis Roulette's filling station. They were standing there looking at the bank with funny expressions on their face. And about that time, I bang, bang, here come a couple of bullets whizzing by. And somebody yelled, "Get in the station and lay on the floor. Somebody's holding up the bank." So we all piled in the filling station, and everybody was laying on the floor except I and an old gentleman by the name of Scott. And he sat on a stool and says, "I'm not going to lay on the floor for anybody." About that time, a bullet broke a pane of glass right by his face, and glass flashed all over him. piece of it cut him on the cheek. And he reached up and put his hand on it and brought it back, and it was bloody. And he says, "Oh my God, I'm shot." And he fainted.
Otis Roulette, the owner of the gas station where the group was taking cover, began loading his own rifle.
And he got the shells, and he was laying on his back behind the door, loading the rifle. And he had some oil cans stacked up in pyramid shape along the front of the counter. All of a sudden, those oil cans just exploded. And a bullet had hit the glass and oil can and splattered all over creation. And the next thing I really remember about this was Durand stepped out, and I can see him firing up the street twice to the west. Bang, bang. Why I did this, I'll never know, but I said, "Here he comes," and I reached for the rifle. Oh, Otis Roulette, he shoved it to me.
It's unclear why the adult owner of the gas station handed his loaded gun to the 17-year-old boy who was there skipping school. Perhaps Otis felt the young man next to him seemed more willing to shoot back, or perhaps Otis felt that Tip was a better shot.
And while he's firing up the street, I'm getting the rifle around and aimed at him. He turned and he saw me in the doorway, and he was coming down, aiming the pistol right at me when I pulled the trigger. And I've always thought if I hadn't beat him to the trigger pull, I wouldn't be here.
Earl Durand was still alive after Tipton Cox's bullet hit him in the chest, but for some reason, he stopped his advance and dragged himself back into the bank.
After Durand went down, they put the pistol under his chin and pulled the trigger, and the bullet came out the back of his head, as I was told later. For the first hour or two, I was real calm. Didn't think much about it, really. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me how close I come to getting killed, and then you feel like a wet noodle. I wouldn't want to do it every day, but no regrets. It has never bothered me a bit. You hate to shoot anybody, but it felt good about doing the right thing, which at the time was the only thing I could do.
At some point, the photo described at the start of this episode was taken of Tipton Cox outside of the bank. He was flown from Cody to Denver and then rode a train to New York, courtesy of the New York City radio program, The People Speak, in which he read a brief account of what happened. The year after Earl Durand's rampage, Tipton had a very Wyoming encounter with the memory of the man he'd shot.
I think the following year, after the Durand incident, we each had 10 Boy Scouts, anywhere from 10 to 12 years old, and they took us up at Sawtooth Lake, and there's a kind of a flat on the lower end of the lake covered with pine trees. Earl Durand had carved his name in this tree, and the date was 1937. I think it was July 1937. As far as I know, it's probably still there.
In doing research for this story, I found a second picture of Tipton Cox in the Park County Historical Archives. In this photo, Tipton's older now, and he's on the right side of the picture shaking hands with a boy whose life he'd saved after he'd fallen off a cliff during a Boy Scout outing. I learned that after high school, Tipton became an officer in the Marine Corps and flew in World War II, as well as served in the Korean conflict, and spent the rest of his life flying in different capacities before his death in 2006. The audio you heard today of Tipton Cox was actually recorded back in the 1990s by Mark Youngie. I wanted to make sure to thank Mark for the great job you did on that interview and for letting me use the interview, as well as the Wyoming State Archives, which made the interview available online. I'd like to thank Tipton Cox's surviving family members for his service in the military, as well as for his willingness to talk about what happened that day in Powell. I also want to make sure to thank Jared Metz, not only for your interview, but for your book, The Last 11 Days of Earl Durand, which I have a link to in the description, and which I used extensively in preparing this podcast. I hope everyone will please check out Jared's book, and I hope you guys will tune in next time soon. Thanks.